Hi, good morning, fellow Sabahans and friends and followers of North Borneo Historical Society. Thank you for your time today and joining us in this special Facebook Live interview. We have a guest coming all the way from Sydney, Australia, who will be talking about a very important history related to All right. Apologies for that. There's a bit of a connection issue. All right. So today we'll be talking about Sandakan Death Marches, which is, I mentioned earlier, it's a very important history. And this year is the 75th anniversary of the end of the World War II. And for this Sandakan Death Marches, as I mentioned, it's a very important history. In fact, many Malaysians do not know about the history that happened um, in Sabah. Even when I talk to some of my Malaysian friends, they are not aware of this history and how it affects the course of our nation. So today we have a very important guest. Her name is Lynette Silver. She's from Sydney, Australia, and she's a very popular writer and also a historian. And she'll be talking to us today about the Sandakan Death Marches. Hi, Lynette. Welcome to North Borneo Historical Society.
Thank you very much. Selamat pagi.
Selamat pagi to all. All right, so let's just start right away, yeah?
Sure.
All right. All right, Lynette. First of all, welcome to the show. Maybe you just want to give a bit of introduction on how did you get involved with this writing a book related to Sabah's history.
I'd always known about the Sandakan story as a small child because my father had known somebody who was a prisoner of war there and had escaped. So I grew up with the story. I knew most of it, and it wasn't until I was quite mature that I realised that nobody else did. But my interest was really sparked in it when I looked at a long-standing, about a 10-year claim that prisoners of war had not been rescued by Australian paratroops because General MacArthur, the American commander, had refused to supply the aircraft at the last minute. I looked at that and I didn't believe it because MacArthur had retaken the Philippines. He loved everybody to love him. This would be a very popular thing to do. But more importantly, 12 months before this rescue was to take place, he had given the go-ahead for the mission to proceed. So my logic was, why would you pull a plug at the very last minute on a mission to save prisoners of war when you had approved it for nearly 12 months? So I went in search of the paperwork. I thought maybe something very dramatic had happened in Sabah and something gone wrong. And when I discovered that the Australian general on our side was the only person who had levelled this accusation against MacArthur, I thought something might be amiss. Went into the secret archives, found that a lot of paperwork had been removed, that the files had actually been culled, but with some lateral thinking found a second copy, and in that it proved to me that the rescue mission had been cancelled because the Australian team collecting the intelligence had got it wrong. They had sent back information to Australia in the beginning of April 45 that the prison camp had been abandoned and everybody was on the west coast, which of course wasn't true. That then led me to want to find out more. And in unravelling that story and finding the evidence to prove that this terrible disaster had taken place, I came across files that had not been looked at since 1945, including the fate of every single prisoner of war in the story. And that is how I started it. I started at the wrong end, actually. I unravelled the story from the wrong end. And by the time I got back to the beginning, I'd found out everything there was to find.
Hi, Lynette. Sorry about that.
I've lost you.
I don't know what happened. My apologies for that. Um, so the internet wasn't so cooperative this morning. But please continue. My apologies again.
I don't know where I dropped out. So,
You were at the General MacArthur part.
oh, General MacArthur. Well, I knew that he had given the go ahead for this mission to take place. So the logic was, why would he pull the plug on it almost at the time of the rescue when he had sanctioned the plan for 12 months? And it just didn't seem possible. So I went searching in Canberra for the paperwork to do with this mission and found that somebody had removed all of the paperwork relevant to the rescue mission. And it was only by a lot of lateral thinking that I found it. And when I did find it, I found the radio signals coming out of Sandakan of Borneo, which told the Australians at this end that the mission was not going to take place, basically because there was nobody left at Sandakan. Everybody had been moved to the west coast. Now, this was in April of 1945, and all but about 400 were still there. So I knew then that something dramatic had happened. And by the time I got to the bottom of the story, I found that the story of General MacArthur not giving us the aeroplanes was simply a story invented by an Australian general to cover up for the fact that the Australian team had wrecked the intelligence.
All right. So as you have written and all the research that you've done, there were a total of 2,428 prisoners of wars that were based in Sandakan. So how did these POWs end up in Sandakan actually?
Well, if the Japanese had had their way, they wouldn't have, because according to the Japanese code, you're supposed to kill yourself rather than surrender. And unexpectedly, they found that 130,000 Allied troops had surrendered at Singapore, including 15,000 Australians. So in order to make use of these people who they had to feed, they sent them to various parts of their empire to do work. And that's the reason why eventually about 2,500 Australian and British POWs were sent to Sandakan in Borneo to build an airstrip, which was, of course, against all regulations with warfare, but that didn't make any difference to the Japanese. They just went ahead.
So as you can see on the screen, this is actually the aerial view of the airstrip in Sandakan. But this was taken right after the war in 1945. So gives you a bit of a general overview of how the area looks like. As you can see, a lot of the surrounding areas are still covered by thick jungle back then. Is that right, Lynette?
Yes, there's two airstrips there. They built the main one first. That was completed by the end of 1942. There was a huge effort to get it finished. And then bays and taxiways and a second airstrip was put in as time went on. The Allies started bombing the place in September of 1944. And by Christmas of 1944, the airstrip was completely out of commission.
Right. So let's jump into the actual the camp itself. Can you describe the conditions there, Lynette?
Yes, the camp was no better or worse than any other prison camp for quite a period of time. When the prisoners first arrived there, they had plenty of food. They had 700 grams of rice per person per day, which is an extraordinary amount. The Australians were only used to eating rice in rice puddings. So they were pleased to trade it with the locals, and people actually put on condition. That means they put on weight in the first 6 months or so they were there. They did quite well. The work was hard. The guards could be quite cruel, but life was all right. They had concerts, and as long as you worked hard and kept out of the Japanese way, it was okay. However, if you ran foul of the Japanese, there were punishments that were meted out, and as time went on, those punishments became more and more severe. In the photograph here, you can see this is an incident that took place in February of 1943, when a boxing champion, of all people, remonstrated with a Japanese guard who was washing his underwear in the rice water that was to be used for the lunch. And when the Japanese guard took no notice, this fellow called Jimmy flattened the guard with a very strong uppercut, and as a result he was tied onto sharpened pieces of wood with wet rope and a bar behind his elbows, and as he sat in the sun the ropes tightened as they constricted, and he only survived because some of his mates created a diversion which allowed someone to cut the ropes. But that was the sort of punishment that they were capable of if you did anything that made them annoyed.
Right, right. And how about this one,
Oh,
Lynette?
and this one, if you ran foul of the Japanese, they might put you in the cage for a period of time, anything from 7 days to 40 days. And you couldn't stand up, you couldn't lie down. You were allowed out for about half an hour in the afternoon for a little bit of exercise, which consisted of the guard belting you with his rifle butt. And
Right.
people actually died in the cage. They didn't survive it.
Oh no.
This is a picture of the skips that were brought in to speed up the airfield construction. They were on rails used by the local timber people for hauling timber, and they brought in, and the prisoners here are levelling the airstrip ground prior to the runway being completed.
Right, right. So I was made to understand that this part of the history wasn't revealed until much later after the end of the war. Why is that, Lynette?
Well, mostly it was because the story was so horrific. We haven't got to this part of the story yet, but by the time of this interview, you're going to learn that all but 6 of the 2,500 prisoners died, some in dreadful circumstances. About 1,000 died as a result of death marches into the interior. About 1,400 died at the Sandakan camp. When the war was over and Australian investigating officers arrived to find there were 6 left alive, this was the worst atrocity perpetrated against Australians in the whole of the Second World War. Consequently, a decision was made not to give out information about the circumstances because the relatives of these men had suffered for 3 years not knowing where they were as prisoners, knowing nothing about them, and now to tell them they were dead and that the circumstances of their death had been in many cases horrific, the government and the army decided it was just too big a cross for these relatives to bear. The other side of the story, of course, was a bit more sinister. It was also kept very quiet on the secret operations side because the gathering of the intelligence had been such a disaster that the rescue mission had been called off. And for that reason, that's why the files were culled, evidence removed, and they hoped that this story of the failed rescue mission would be a secret forever, which of course it wasn't.
Right. Because I remember you mentioned that when I had a conversation with you, you actually went to Canberra and tried to get some classified, I don't know, maybe some documents related to these death marches.
Well, to elaborate on that, I went to Canberra to look at the secret working files of this rescue mission called Operation Kingfisher. And I had a background in special operations. I'd done several books on behind the lines missions by Australians, and I knew what these files should look like and what should be in them. And when I opened it up, the plan for the rescue mission was there, but all the details that should have been there from the field party collecting intelligence, intelligence summaries, what was going on, there wasn't a single shred of evidence. There was not a word there. And that's when I realised that the paperwork pertaining to the intelligence gathering had definitely been removed. And I think I said before, but we might have lost it when we had that glitch, that I found the second copy in a completely different file. And when I read those messages coming out of the field that had been decoded, they said quite bluntly that we have reliable information that there are no prisoners of war left at Sandakan. They've been moved to the west coast. We will send confirmation within a fortnight. Now, the next message that came said categorically, we confirm there are no prisoners of war left at Sandakan. Now, that was the middle of April of 1945. The rescue mission was scheduled for the 30th of April. And at that point, the whole of the rescue mission fell apart. And it wasn't until the middle of June, when one of the prisoners of war survived and got to it, the Americans, that we learned that this intelligence had been completely wrong and that all chance to rescue the prisoners had been lost.
Understood. So you mentioned that when the prisoners of war, when they arrived Sandakan, at least for the first few months, it was everything was fine, everything was okay. But it was not until 1943 when things started to go bad. So what actually happened?
Well, when the prisoners arrived there, they discovered that the locals had set up an underground movement to assist white internees who were on Bahala Island at that stage. And when those internees were moved down to Kuching to another camp, the attention turned to help the prisoners of war in the POW camp. It was very well set up. They had some very prominent people there that were working very diligently and also at great risk for their lives. And as a result, the Australians were able to build a radio from bits and pieces smuggled in by local people. They were then getting news from the outside world, and everything was going along very well until a local man, who was Chinese actually, was infiltrated into the camp as a spy. He realised something was going on, and the next thing, the whole of the underground movement was betrayed. A large number of people were rounded up in town and brought in for questioning by the Kempi Tai. By questioning, I mean torture. A good number of the prisoners of war were taken in, and as a result of that interrogation, those deemed to be involved were sent to Kuching for trial. At the end of that trial, 8 local people were shot dead, executed, and the senior Australian officer. The other Australians were sent to Singapore for further punishment in a punishment jail, and the other local people were sent to work with hard labour. Now, at that point, because of the underground system, the Japanese really clamped down on life in the camp. There were very few concerts anymore. They weren't allowed to smoke. They were bashed and belted the whole time, and security was stepped up, and life from about October of 1943 became much more difficult. It deteriorated even more in 1944 because Japan was losing the war. Food stocks were getting low. Japanese morale was not as good as it should have been. And as each day wore on, life in Sandakan became much harder for the locals and also for the prisoners at the camp.
And at that point in time, even the Allied forces were surrounding the waters of Borneo. So I guess a lot of the food supply was cut off as well, and probably the Japanese also like felt pressure because they were able to get food, and of course affecting the locals too, right?
Well, the locals learnt very quickly that if they grew excess crops, they wouldn't have them for very long. And so anything they grew, they tried to hoard from themselves because the Japanese were just taking it. And as a result, there was great hardship amongst the local people in Sabah. 14%, it's estimated, of Sabah's population, civilian population, died as a result of the difficulties during the war, the period the Japanese were there. The photograph on the screen here shows one of the punishments that the Japanese had for people working on the airstrip. It was called flying practice. And prisoners were required to stand with their arms out, look at the sun for prolonged periods, maybe 1 or 2 hours. If your back sagged or your arms dropped, you would get a hefty whack across the back with a stick, and they would come home from working at the airstrip with these great welt marks across their backs.
Wow.
This is a picture of the camp. The accommodation, part of it was quite good. It was made of timber boards with a hut-up roof, and on the left there you can see a very large mangaris tree, which the prisoners called the big tree because it was about 200 or 300 feet or 100 metres tall, massive tree. And behind you can see the kapok trees, which were growing on the local government experimental farm, because this camp was on the experimental farm, which the British had set up to test various crops and trees to see if they were suited to Borneo's climate.
Right. So
we see here a layout of the camp. On the left-hand side, you see the big tree, the huts running towards the front of the screen, the other ranks' huts. The other ones are the officers' huts. On the right-hand side, you see a much bigger layout of the camp, and this also shows the British camp, which is closest to us. It's the Australian camps in the distance, and in the middle you can see a big sign with POW.
Right.
That was put up in 1945 to let Allied aircraft who were constantly strafing and bombing the area know that it was a POW camp. And that was put out in the open and made by the prisoners of war.
I see. So you briefly mentioned just a while ago that there was a sort of a relationship established between the prisoners of war and local people. Can you please elaborate on that, please?
Yes, it was great, and it was very close. The local people, of course, were suffering the same way as the prisoners of war, and they were determined to do what they could for the war effort. So from the very beginning, the Australians in particular, because the British didn't have contact with the local people, were very much in tune with trying to do what they could to thwart the Japanese from having any success in the area. The Australians were in constant contact with the local after they were killed and they were punished. Australians didn't ever forget about them, those that were involved. They always realised that these local people had laid their lives on the line and given their lives to help the prisoners of war. When they were in the camp, the locals did what they could to get extra food to them, push food beneath the wire, try to slip them extra food out at the airstrip, deliver notes from the underground movement, and this created a very, very close bond from 1942 onwards, and that bond continues to today because it
Right.
was Australian troops that liberated Sabah from the Japanese, and
Yes.
also Australian expertise that built the main road from Sandakan to Mt Kinabalu, and also the road from Tenom up to Tambunan. So we had a lot of involvement there during that period, and also Australian troops came to Sabah's aid during the confrontation with Indonesia
Yeah.
back in the 1960s after the British went. So this rapport has been ongoing, and it's particularly strong. It's still there today, and Australians are always made very, very welcome by local people and always made to feel as if Sabah is a second home in many ways.
Yeah, it's not too far anyway. So it seems that there's some factual error, I mean, related to this whole tragedy, whereby if you visit one of the places, there's a plaque that says there were a total of 2,700 instead of 2,428 based on your research. Can you just tell us briefly on that, please?
Yes, about 2,750 prisoners of war were actually sent to Sandakan, British and Australian. But after there were various moves, for instance, all the officers were sent to Kuching and 100 British were sent down to Labuan in another label force. By the time all that happened, that left us with 2,434 prisoners of war, of whom 6 survived. The story then gets further distorted because quite often you read, and there's a plaque to this effect up at Ranau, that 2,700 Australian and British prisoners of war were sent on a march to Ranau, which of course is not
Right.
true.
Mm-hmm.
1,000 total left the camp.
Yeah.
Of those, about 800 were Australian, 200 were British, and the majority of them never left Sandakan. So when we
Right.
talk about the death marches, they were terrible and they took a lot of life, but they didn't wipe out all the prisoners of war as many people suppose.
Yeah.
The ones that were sent into the interior, first of all, on the first march, to make use of their labour after the airstrip was bombed, and the second lot was sent after the Japanese believed that intensive bombing by the Allies at the end of May in 1945 was going to result in invasion. Now, it's a picture here of the bombing going on. You can see a bomb blast at the back there on the edge of town, and also the plane that's just delivered the bomb on the right-hand side at the foreground. This bombing was intensive, and towards the end of May, it really stepped up, not because the Allies were going to invade Sandakan, not at all. It was a ploy. The big
Yes.
invasion was to take place on the 10th of June over on the west coast in Brunei Bay and Labuan. And all this bombing and attack was to make the Japanese think that invasion from the Philippines was imminent.
Right.
It worked. And as a result, the Japanese pulled as many troops as they could, plus prisoners of war who could walk, and I use that term very lightly because they were in terrible condition, into the interior, leaving almost 300 behind at the camp, not because they were callous, but because they and the prisoners of war believed that within a couple of days an invasion fleet would arrive. Of course, that didn't happen, and every one of those prisoners who was left behind perished.
Right. So instead of there, because all the while, I mean, when this was mentioned and about this history, they just say Sandakan Death March, whereby it should be Sandakan Death Marches because there were multiple marches that
Yeah,
happened.
three altogether. One at the end of January, which was they were still pretty fit at that stage, and in actual fact, 3/4 of those that marched 250 grueling kilometres through the jungle, which
Um,
hadn't even been explored. It was uncharted territory.
right.
Made it to the end, but it was the conditions at Ranau that killed them. Dysentery broke out, and you can see here from this close-up of this map, this is the hand-drawn map drawn by people searching for the bodies, and you can see there the little dots and the river
Right.
crossing where they're following. This is the middle section of the march. They're following the Tavio River through an area which was just a guesstimate in those days. The old maps were hopeless. You couldn't have used them. The British hadn't surveyed it. No one had done anything. And it passed through this uninhabited, very, very rugged territory. Now, despite the tremendous mountain ranges and the swamps and everything else that they had to contend with, one group of prisoners in this first march covered that distance in 14 days, 250 kilometres in 14 days. With very little food. There wasn't proper food dumps organised. And as I said, 3/4 reached the destination, but the conditions at the end killed them. Dysentery broke out, and they just got very sick. And by June, a few months after they set out from Sandakan, there were only 6 left alive out of 455 that had set off. That was the attrition rate was absolutely amazing. The next march went at the end of May because the Japanese thought that they were going to be invaded. These people were in very, very poor condition, and about 2/3 died along the way. And when I say died, sometimes it was from the illness or exhaustion. Sometimes it was the Japanese were actually killing them, which makes us in the West recoil with horror until you know that Japanese standing orders in their military at the time were anyone who can't keep up on a retreat, which is what this was, is to be disposed of. And that included the Japanese troops accompanying them. For every 15 POWs who died, roughly between 8 and 10 Japanese died as well. But we don't hear about that very often, but it goes to show that well-fed Japanese troops were dying at that rate from the effect of this march. And it says huge amounts for these emaciated prisoners of war, who were also dying, but not at the rate you would have expected compared to the Japanese.
Right.
And this photograph here is at mile 16. You can see there a mile post. The British were very organised. They put mile posts every mile and every half mile along their roads and tracks. And straight opposite, a Chinese farmer had found the body of a prisoner of war there who died a short distance from the camp, 8 miles from the camp actually, and buried him at the side of the road.
Right. And I remember when the locals, especially in the interior, they were deliberately changing the routes to confuse the Japanese, or even to make sure that they don't go into the villages that would affect the living of the locals.
Yes, well, when they decided to move these prisoners because there was no work for them with the airstrip completely wrecked, a decision was made to send them to the west coast. At that stage, the American submarines had blockaded Borneo and were destroying Japanese shipping at a tremendous rate, and the Allies had control of the air. So the only way to get there was to walk. Now, there was a dry weather track that led from Sandakan to a a village up along on the Lubbock River. And then there was a track that came in from the west coast for a little distance beyond Mt Kinabalu, but there was nothing in the middle. So the local chiefs from villages were told to cut a track. They knew that if they put the track along the river where everybody lived, so no roads in those days, and the river was the road, that the Japanese would then have access to the girls and the women,
Right.
and also to the young men who would be put into forced labour. So the idea was that as soon as they got anywhere near civilization, the track was routed to another direction. And this is why in the middle section, instead of following an easy path along the very wide Lubbock River, which was an easy way to follow, they took off into this unexplored territory along the Tavia River, which involved, at the end of that valley, the most horrendous climb up about 1,500 feet or whatever, 500 metres today, isn't it? And involved basically up a cliff on zigzagging and then up a tortuous mountain ridge. That climb was so bad that reasonably fit people on the first march, in one group of 50, 5 of them died of exhaustion on that section. So it gives you an idea of just how hard this march was and the tenacity, really, of the prisoners of war who somehow or other kept going. This picture here is a muddy section of the flat part of the track up near Ranau. And it's pretty indicative of what the track was like, about that width, and quite often going in through very, very heavy jungle. They couldn't see the sun. It was dark. They didn't know where they were. Japanese didn't know where they were either. And so when the track took off and went up and down mountains unnecessarily, the Japanese had no idea that they were being led astray, literally, by these village chiefs who'd cut this track, which they thought was for Japanese use. If they had any idea that their POWs that they knew from the town were going to be following this, I'm sure they wouldn't have done it. It was done purely in an effort to help wipe out the Japanese who had to use it.
Right. So I guess even because, as you mentioned, the march itself was grueling. I guess some of them experienced, blisters on their feet, and of course some of them probably got sick as well due to malaria and things like that.
Yes, their clothing, of course, was in tatters mostly. This stage, the first people on the first march were given shirt and shorts second-hand from some sort of army stores that had been confiscated, and very few had boots. They were given slip-on shoes made of rubber that didn't stay on, so most of them went in bare feet. The first marchers were better clad than the second marchers, who were basically wearing just remnants of clothing or a piece of fabric tied around their middles, around with a piece of string. They had nowhere at night to shelter. They stopped. Where they stopped is where they slept. They slept in the roots of big trees. If there was a hut, the Japanese troops took that. It got very cold when they got in the mountains. A lot of them died from real exposure overnight. They had beriberi, they had malaria, they had tropical ulcers on their legs so big that you could see the shin bones showing through. And the second march in particular was in very, very poor condition. They took a month to cover the distance that people on the first march had done in about half that time.
Wow. So out of the the 2000, for the whole tragedy, the death rate, I guess it was about more than 99%. So does it mean that it's Australia's worst war tragedy?
Yes, we don't have anything. We lost people on ships and that sort of thing, but we didn't have a wipeout like this. Our death rate was 99.75%. The British lost everybody. They didn't have a single solitary survivor. So the final figures were 1,787 Australians and 641 British, which brings you to that massive total of 2,428. And you can see here, this is a painting that is now hanging up in the Kundasan War Memorial of the POW, on what was called rice carrying trips. The Japanese forced the first people from the first march in groups of 20 to carry rice 26 kilometres or 26 miles or 40 kilometres back to the village of Paginitan, which was being used as a staging post by the Japanese. The journey took 5 days. 3 days, these bags weighed 20 kilograms. 3 days to carry them in, 2 days to get back, 2 days rest, and you started all over again. And this went on for 6 weeks to supply the Japanese who were stationed there at that village. And this is just a painting it has been done depicting what they imagined it was like.
And I remember during when they were doing this, some of the prisoners of war, they actually used bamboo that they actually poke into the rice bag. Is that correct?
Yes, the conditions up at Ranau were so bad that some of the prisoners who felt they had the energy realised that if they could carry the rice, they would have an opportunity to steal food from native gardens, kill dogs owned by the locals, and also steal the rice. Now, they did this in a very ingenious fashion. The rice bags were stitched at both ends, of course, and they inserted a piece of thin, hollow bamboo into the bottom of the sack and then positioned their water bottles, which they all carried. You can actually see one on the right, on the side of the prisoner on the right-hand side of the picture there, just underneath. They put one end of the bamboo in that and siphoned off enough rice to fill up the water bottle. There was one problem in that the Japanese weighed the sacks before they started and weighed them at the end. And of course, there was going to be a deficiency.
Right.
The prisoners solved this by being very clumsy and stupid as they neared Paginitan, where they had to cross a small stream. And as they crossed the stream, they invariably slipped on the slippery rocks, fell into the water, and the rice bags got wet. So the rice absorbed the water. When the bags were weighed at Paginitan, sometimes they weighed more than when they left. And so that ruse was never, ever discovered by the Japanese. And with the extra food and the stealing the rice, some of the prisoners, including one who eventually did survive, were able to stay alive and keep out of the camp at Ranau, which was full of dysentery. Dysentery is the most debilitating thing to have, and you can die, in a very short period of time. Now, this picture on the screen shows two of the locals. Their surname spelt Funk, F-U-N-K, which is what we call them in Australia, but of course it's Fun, I think, in local pronunciation, but over here we call them Funk. And that's Johnny and Paddy Funk. They were members of the Funk family. Their father was a magistrate in Sandakan, and they were very, very active in the underground movement. Their brother Alexander actually was executed by firing squad for his involvement. These two were lucky to get away with their lives because they had all sorts of stuff hidden at their place, pistols and all sorts of things they shouldn't have, and their house was part of the local centre for the underground movement.
Right. So I just want to touch a bit on the, as you mentioned, the underground movement, right? So that when they do all this intelligence work, I guess that information was fed to the military. But as I remember, there was an planned operation that was meant to rescue the prisoners of war, but didn't happen. Can you just share with us on that, please?
Well, that was the one I spoke about, Operation Kingfisher. But before I go there, all the information that was being collected by the local underground movement was being taken across by other helpers to the Philippines, where the Philippine Liberation Army was set up under the command of the Americans. So a large amount of information that's being collected by the local people did eventually reach the Allies as part of the war effort. But as for Operation Kingfisher, that was a plan that was sanctioned in the middle of 1944 to rescue the prisoners of war by paratroop. Lots of things went wrong and they were delayed for a considerable of time with some really quite appalling mismanagement of this. And it wasn't until March of 1945 that the ground party was eventually inserted by submarine to collect last-minute intelligence which would enable 600 paratroops to drop out at an altitude of about 200 metres into the Sandakan area and rescue the prisoners of war. All that was required was intelligence from the camp itself to so that the invading party would know where the machine gun nests were, what the Japanese setup was during the day, what they were doing, so they could choose the optimum time to have this surprise raid. Now, this was supposed to be collected by Australians, but unfortunately, due to the long delays, the specialised party was cancelled and everybody was put into a new base well to the north of Sandakan, which meant that it was just too far for them to go down to Sandakan to do the reconnaissance, and they were ordered to make use of local people who could collect the intelligence. Well, the idea was fine because the local people were very loyal. And nobody realised was the Japanese had clamped down so much in Sandakan with local contact with the prisoners of war that any local person found within 400 metres of any prisoner of war was to be executed. Now, that's a very big deterrent. Right? Very big deterrent. And so what happened was the local people went down. They went to the villages on the outskirts of Sandakan. They spoke to people there. Now, these people were numerically illiterate for the most part, and they reported that large numbers of prisoners of war had been going along this track to the west for some days. This is on the 1st March. So consequently, it was assumed that this large volume of prisoners of war meant that the camp had been evacuated, when of course it hadn't. It was only the 1st March. Nobody was game enough to go and check up. And so the intelligence was faulty in that it was only a small number of prisoners that had been moved, but the intelligence went back to Australia that everybody had been moved. At that point, everyone was stood down. Landing ships infantry with crack British Marines who were waiting at Leyte Gulf in the Philippines to assist were all sent back to normal naval service. A squadron of Australian planes, we didn't need American ones, a squadron of Australian planes secretly sent to Morotai over the Halmeras. The pilots there and had a very nice time for 2 weeks swimming in the lagoon, and then were stood down and sent back to Australia. And the paratroopers who had been practicing for weeks in North Queensland were all sent on leave. The whole of the mission was put aside, and as I said before, it wasn't until one of the prisoners of war escaped quite early on the 2nd March, and with the help of local Doosan fishermen, managed to get across the Philippines to be rescued by the Americans in the Philippines, blurted out this story that he was on a march with more than 500 people into the interior. That's the first inkling that we had that the camp had not been abandoned.
Right. So for the next few slides, we're going to focus on the locals who helped the escapees, 6 of them. So probably we can just run through the photos, and you just want to do a bit of background story.
Well, this is taken a long time after the war, in 1947 actually, with one of the survivors and a group of locals who are assisting in looking for the remains of prisoners of war along the Death March track. There were 3 separate searches of the camp areas and the march itself, and as a result, 90% of those who died over in Borneo were found, which is a very high proportion when I tell you that in Malaya and Singapore, only half of those who died were ever found. So this was a huge effort by the locals there, and they worked diligently with the Australian recovery teams for 2 or 3 years.
Right.
This one's a much more contemporary one for our story. This is taken at Silad near Ranau in 1945, and standing at the back are 3 of the escapees, and in front of them are some of the helpers who brought them from a mountain hiding place 5 miles to the west of Ranau, where they were hidden for about 4 or 5 weeks, to meet paratroopers who had parachuted into the Ranau area just after the war ended.
Right. I just want to say briefly to the audience this morning. You will be given opportunity to ask questions for Lynette. We still have about 5 minutes to go through all the photos. So if you have any question, please leave them in the comment section below. Just type it out, and then we'll share it with Lynette shortly. All right.
Well, these are 3 of the 6 survivors. Four people escaped from the Ranau end, and 2 escaped on the Death March itself. On the left-hand side is Owen Campbell. He escaped on the Death March quite early, near the village of Mwanad, and he was taken in there by the people, hidden in a false wall in the house, until it was safe enough to get him to an Australian operating behind the lines with the commandos after some weeks. The next man is Harry Jackson, who was in charge of going back to Sabah after the war, finding the locals who'd helped the Australians and rewarding them with money. And those widows of the men who'd lost their lives were given substantial pensions. The Australians had no obligation to do this. It was British territory. But the Australian government and the army felt so strongly of the great work that was done by the locals that they did everything they could to alleviate their conditions after the war. The next fellow, who's the thinnest one, that's Keith Bottrell, one of the survivors from Ranau, and with him is Nelson Short, also one of the survivors from Ranau.
Right.
By this time, 3 others were dead. Stipwich, who was in the other photograph, was killed crossing the street. Another one, Bill Moxon, was so tormented by what had happened that he committed suicide in the 1960s, and the other one had died of cancer.
All right. So currently we only have 1 survivor left. Is that correct?
No, none now. Owen Campbell was the last one.
Owen Campbell was the one.
He died some time ago, back about 2003, I think.
2003. Okay.
Oh, when you say survivor, I'm talking here about the 6 who escaped. Yes, we do have somebody who's still alive who was at Sandakan. And the reason he's still alive he was only 15 when he joined up in the army.
Correct.
He attempted to escape and was caught and was taken to Kuching for trial, found guilty of an escape attempt and sent to Singapore to the punishment jail, which he amazingly survived, which means that he's the only person anywhere in the world now who was actually at Sandakan. He's 95 this year.
Right. And he's when he joined, he was still a teenager.
Yes, 15. He was an orphan, and he joined up so he would get 3 meals a day because he was hungry, and he spent all his teenage years as a prisoner of war. He was still a teenager when the war ended. 16 till 19 and a half. Yes.
So young. Okay.
Now, this is one of Sabah's greatest heroes, and you should be all very proud of this man. He unfortunately died just 2 or 3 years ago. His name, we called him Sini, was his nickname, but his real name was Chin Chi Kong. Before that, it was Chin Pian Sin, but he changed his name as he got older. And this is a photograph of the governor, resplendent in his ostrich feather hat, pinning on him the highest award that you could possibly have as a civilian for courage. And Sini, who was in the Boy Scouts at the time, also received the highest award from the scouting movement for courage. He was very highly decorated civilian, and only quite small and quite young at the time, but took huge risks working in the underground movement. Very, very brave man.
So brave.
He's only a teenager. Here's a couple more teenagers. These are 2 of the locals who were helping hide 4 of the escapees in the jungle to the west of Ranau. And this is taken at Silad after they had managed to get their people through the back trails to join up with the Australian paratroops, because the Japanese were still looking for the escapees, and there was a price on their heads, including huge bags of rice and money. If you consider that the local community was in terrible circumstances, they must have been very tempted to betray these people, but nobody said a word.
Wow. All right. So Lynette, I just want to ask, and probably you can share as well, what do you think is the most important legacy from these death marches?
And the most important legacy from these death marches for Australians is the friendship that we still have with Sabah today, which started right back in those dreadful days of the Second World War. And for this reason, I was motivated to put up the first proper thank you to the local people in the Church of St. Michael and All Angels in Sandakan, where the prisoners of war sheltered for the night before they were marched to their final captivity. They're in the form of magnificent world-class stained glass windows, paid for entirely by Australians and some British who wanted to express their gratitude to the local people for what they'd done. So the windows of remembrance are to remember the Australians and British who lost their lives, but they're also a thanksgiving to the local people who gave their lives, in many cases, to protect them. This was followed by another set of windows, which we called the friendship windows. And they're in the north and south transepts. They're equally magnificent, and they are purely to celebrate the friendship that we have between Australia and Sabah. And this story is so awful, so shocking, so much suffering on many levels, that it's good to think that something positive came out of it, and that is this ongoing comradeship, which Sabahans have for Australians in particular, and for which we as Australians are very grateful and are the beneficiaries.
Wow. All right. So before we move on to the final question, I'm going to present some of the questions asked by our audience this morning. Let's have first one from Balvinda. Hi, Lynette. How well known is this tragedy amongst Australians?
Well, I've been at it for nearly 30 years, and it's getting better known. But until I wrote my book, Sandakan, A Conspiracy of Silence, we didn't even have an alphabetical list or a true list of the victims, let alone what happened to them, because the story had been covered up for such a long time. So consequently, although all Australians know about the Burma Thai railway atrocities, which were perpetrated against prisoners up in building that railway for the Japanese, this story has been lost. And the reason it's been lost is because it wasn't spoken about. Not even the relatives of the prisoners of war didn't even know what had happened to them. So it's quite a big battle to get it better known. But this program, for instance, will help spread the word, and I hope that Sabahans, who now know a little bit more about it, will also help us, because it is a story that we should never forget.
That's true. So what do you think about maybe a possibility of, Hollywood grade movie about Sandakan Death Marches? What do you think about that?
Well, I think it would be a very harrowing movie to watch. I think it could be done if it were done just on the basis of several key people in the story set in the background of the prisoner of war story. I know today with digital technology that you can create emaciated people thin enough to go on the march, but it would. And there's been several attempts, but unfortunately they haven't come to anything. Making movies is a very, very expensive business. And
Right.
although people have been quite excited about the concept, I think the stumbling block is actually the finance.
Yes, correct. We have another question from the audience. Hi, Lynette. Can those histories and photos be found in Australian Museum?
Yeah, all the paperwork pertaining to the death marches and to Sandakan and everything else, the war crimes trials, all held in Australian archives and at the Australian War Memorial, but they're in various places. Some are in Melbourne, some are in Canberra archives, and some are at the War Memorial. Very little is held in Sabah, but fortunately a lot of it's online. The Australian archives are very generous, and they've put a large amount of this material online, and anybody around the world can sit there and read the war crimes trials, which are pretty grim reading, I can tell you. But it does enable you to get to the facts from the survivors' mouths themselves. I mean, what better source have you got than to go back to the original eyewitnesses?
Right, right. All right. So since we've been talking about a lot about the how the locals help the escapees and of course the prisoners of war, what do you think we can do? I mean, as Sabahans, we can do more to highlight the locals who have helped them.
Well, you've already started, but unfortunately, with the change in government and the change in the forestry director, and then this jolly virus, this has been on the back burner. The forestry director and his wonderful staff have built the most fantastic gallery dedicated to a fellow called Twati Akai. Twati was a track cutter who attempted to help prisoners of war in the Boto area in the middle part of Sabah. And there's a gallery there with great storyboards and fantastic material built just near Sabah, near Boto. there's what we call the Zudin platform, which is a platform which has been built to overlook the site of that grueling climb I spoke about, where the prisoners died of exhaustion. And that's been named the Zudin platform after a local man who lived over on the Labuk River, but belonged to a group of local youths who formed a blowpipe gang. Now, they spent quite a large time during the war, when Japanese were using this trick, by stalking Japanese who were a bit behind the rest of the pack, might have been sick or a bit behind, and killing them with their blowpipes. Now, they accounted for 200 to 300 Japanese in that way, and Zudin also led the search teams across the Death March track 3 times after the war, looking for the body. So these particular places have been named after these heroes, and that was an initiative that was done by your forestry people. So they've started, but until we have the opening, which hasn't happened yet, the publicity for that has not reached the local papers. But if you drive between Kota Kinabalu and Sandakan, and you know where to look, you can go in and look at those 2 great initiatives that have been put in already.
Right. I just want to highlight, probably there's one comment here. Australia has Anzac Day, 25th April. Yes, is based upon one day in 1915, yet it is the day we remember all those lost during war. Not a day to celebrate, yet I've been living in Sabah for 20 years. I could not tell you what day Malaysia remembers its conflicts, etc.
Well, I can tell you that, yes, Malaysia does remember its conflicts on Remembrance Day. Remembrance Day goes back to the First World War, when the guns were silent at the 11th hour, at the 11th day of the 11th month. And I know that every year down in Labuan, there is quite a large service held there on the Sunday closest to Remembrance Day. So it is celebrated at least there. I don't know if there's anything in Kota Kinabalu, but that is the day most of the world remembers their war dead. Australia has an extra one. We have that one, but our big one is the 25th of April, which is called Anzac Day. And yes, does go back to the 25th of April 1915, when Australian and New Zealand troops lost many lives lost in Gallipoli in Turkey.
Right. So I guess for example, some local Sabahans who are interested to experience the death march itself, how do they do this?
Well, just before I go there, anyone in Sabah who's interested in commemorating war dead can always come to the Anzac Day service held at Sandakan each year at the Memorial Park, which is in April, and also a day which we set up. I help the tourism board and the local council with this. On the 15th of August every year in Sandakan, it's Sandakan Day. And on that date, it is a focus of everybody who suffered in the war at the hands of the Japanese in Sabah. So we have a lot of local people attending, people whose fathers were killed by the Japanese or suffered. Everybody joins in, and when this won't, I think it's going to be on this year, but there won't be a big gathering. But next year it should be back on track. Urge people to go along to that on the 15th of August, because that is a very special day of local remembrance. Now, I've now forgotten what question you asked me. Question you asked me before that.
No, that's all right. I think we have just about 1 minute left. Anything else you want to share with the audience before we end the show?
No, my husband's just here. I think he remembered the question you asked. Oh, the Death March. Yes, locals.
Yeah,
the
participate?
Local people can join. Well, first of all, I'm still doing it. Can join me on one of the Death Marches I do. But Tam Yao Kong, who's a local man and very expert trekker, he can take groups of people at any time along the Death March who are local. And it is an amazing experience. It's hard. You're a bit more used to the heat than we are. It's hard. It can be very emotional. People get very emotionally involved, but it does give you a little tiny insight, despite the fact that you're wearing Nike shoes and good clothes and you're being very well fed, into the horrific conditions suffered by the prisoners of war who had no shoes, no food, no shelter, and still managed to do it. So when you do it and you feel you have a sense of accomplishment, you've got to then think about, well, here I am. I've got everything going for me. and I think I've accomplished something, but it's nothing compared to what those people who walked that death march the original time did. And you need to keep in mind the whole time you're doing it that it was a one-way trip.
Right.
So you can see more on sandakandeathmarch.com, which is Tom's website. And also anyone who's interested can look at my website with a lot of material on there, including pictures that somebody asked about, and taken from the Australian War Memorial, and also private collections are on there. And that's my website, LynetteSilver.com. And if anyone wants to contact me after this session, I'm easily contactable. It just says contact Lynette, and you can send me an email. I'll be quite happy. I get hundreds of emails every week from people all around the world who want to know a bit more about this story. So I can do that. And if I tell you, then perhaps you can help spread the story. And perhaps before I'm dead, we might have this story much better known.
Yeah, that's great. Anyway, Lynette, I would like to say thank you for your time today. I think it is a great insight, very in-depth story about the Sandakan Death Marches. I'm looking forward to probably have more sessions with you. We can go into some of the details, depending if the audience, if they're interested. But once again, thank you for your time, and please say hi to Neil. I'm sure he's sitting next to you. Please say hi to him, and also thank you to the audience for your time. If you have any comments, please continue to leave your comments below. Any specific for Lynette, I'll try to get the answer for you. Okay, Lynette, thanks again, and please take care.
Thank you, and everybody keep safe.
All right then. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.